Welcome to this Faith and Order webinar under the theme, The Whole People of God. In today's webinar, we want to continue our discussion on what it means that the Church always and at all times exists as a community of people, the whole people of God. How do we understand the role of every member of the Church, of the special ministries of the Church, and how important is this discussion for the unity of the Christian Church? The famous convergence text, Baptism, Eucharist and Ministry from 1982, in its chapter on ministry, underlined the following. Christ established a new access to the Father. Living in this communion with God, all members of the Church are called to confess their faith and to give account of their hope. They are to identify with the joys and sufferings of all people as they seek to witness in caring love. The members of Christ's body are to struggle with the oppressed towards that freedom and dignity promised with the coming of the kingdom. This mission needs to be carried out in varying political, social, and cultural contexts. In order to fulfill this mission faithfully, they will seek relevant forms of witness and service in each situation. In so doing, they bring to the world a foretaste of the joy and glory of God's kingdom. So this is how BEM elaborated on ministry and the ministry of the whole people of God. Before elaborating on the questions of the ordained ministry, BEM starts with an emphasis on the ministry and service of every Christian as the foundation for the understanding of the specific ordained ministry. Our second convergence text from Faith and Order, The Church Towards a Common Vision, TCTCV, which is at the heart of today's webinar, subscribes onto this understanding of BEM that emphasizes that every Christian receives gifts of the Holy Spirit for the upholding of the Church and for his or her part in the mission of Christ. And TCTCV says, strengthened by the Spirit, Christians are called to live out their discipleship in a variety of forms of service. Thus, the Church Towards a Common Vision confirmed and strengthened BEM's understanding and emphasis that it is the whole people of God and also the institution of an ordained ministry, a ministry of word, sacrament, and oversight, which belong to the being of the Church. At the same time, the divisive questions related to the understanding of roles and services in the Church and the relation between the ministry of the whole people of God and the ordained ministry are to a large degree and remain unsolved. There's also no agreement between the churches how divisive different understandings and orders of ministry and services are for the unity of the Christian Church. Our question today is, how did the churches receive the Church Towards a Common Vision and its understanding of roles and services in the Church? Here you see the Church Towards a Common Vision, the documents collected in 2 volumes called Churches Respond, Respond to the Church Towards a Common Vision. This is about 700 pages with the Church's responses to TCTCV. And you will also find online and as prints a publication called What Are the Churches Saying About the Church? Key findings and proposals from the responses to the Church Towards a Common Vision. So this has been a process going on from 2015 to 2020, where we have been studying thoroughly the responses of the churches and also tried to focus on specific themes which came up in many of the responses and to look into what are the churches today actually saying about the understanding of the Christian Church based on TCTCV. Our question today is, how did the churches receive TCTCV and its understanding of roles and services in the Church? You can find all the responses of the churches on the W website, And as I said, they are also published within the Faith and Order paper series. Our question today then is, how important are the questions of ministerial order for the churches today? Do we need a threefold ministry in order to acknowledge each other as churches? What about the question of gender and ministry, which is almost hidden both in BEM and TCTCV, but which we all know is a burning issue both in and between our churches? How do we understand the role of all the baptized for the upbuilding and upholding of the Christian church? In today's webinar, we will listen to two Faith and Order commissioners who have studied all the church's responses very thoroughly, especially when it comes to the understanding of the threefold ministry and the role of women in church. We will also have the pleasure to listen to Bishop Brian Farrell from the Roman Catholic Church, responding to the papers and giving an input on the Roman Catholic response to TCTCV. The first speaker today is Susan Durbe. Susan will elaborate on the role of women in the church as described in the responses from the churches to TCTCV. Reverend Dr. Susan Durbe is a minister of the United Reformed Church in the UK. She has served as a local minister and as principal of Westminster College in Cambridge. She has published a book and articles on the parables of Jesus, books on preaching and collections of prayers. As a former theological advisor for Christian Aid, she has published on poverty, on gender, and on climate change. Today, she is the moderator of the Faith and Order Commission of the World Council of Churches, and we are very happy that you will introduce us into the theme, the role of women in the church today.
So, as Stephanie has emphasized, the Church Towards a Common Vision, in common with BEM, emphasizes that the whole people of God is called to be a prophetic people, bearing witness to God's word, a priestly people, and a royal people, and all members of the church share in this vocation. This is a key quotation from the Church Towards a Common Vision, which comes early on, that's paragraph 19 in the text, and it's foundational. But I think that it was separated from the later sections on ministry, and so some people haven't noticed its significance. It sets the context for much later conversations. It's one of the ecumenical gains of recent decades that in all our churches, we now speak together readily and confidently about the ministry of the whole people of God. Everyone is part of the ministry of the church. It's become something we can all say. And Faith and Order works by celebrating convergence, but then moving on to say more about the things that still divide us. So any and all of our talk about women and men in the church, or of the whole people of God, and ordination, has to be seen in light of this kind of commitment. The second slide, another foundation quote for me from TCTCV, and I think the most beautiful sentence is the one from the beginning of the final chapter. The first and foremost attitude of God towards the world is love for every child, woman, and man who has ever become part of human history, and indeed for the whole of creation. Every child, woman, and man. But questions related to the roles of women and men in the world or in the church, or about how we are human beings in God's sight as male and female, are becoming much more difficult areas of division among us in the churches today. And you might think it is curious that TCTCV says rather little about this, and some of the responses did say this. We are in a very different place now from earlier discussions of the role of women than, say, at the time of BEM. theological discussion related to women was in those days predominantly about ordination, about whether women might be or should be ordained as priests or deacons. In some contexts, that is still a lively discussion. But now we live in cultures and within churches where the conversation has shifted towards a broader reflection, and in some ways a more demanding one, on the whole understanding of what it is to be human before God. Whether we're talking about sociology or biology or psychology or theology, this has become a very contested question. So if I could put this really starkly, you could say that where once the discussion in the churches was, may a woman be ordained? The question has now become, what is a woman? And where gender was once simply a term for thinking about our being made male and female, it now represents for some a whole variety of discourses that challenge the ways in which we have called people male and female. Today, some would talk of male and female as reflecting a false gender binary, while others would see that challenge as dangerous and unsettling, even as heresy. There are conversations about being trans or gender fluid, and not only gender, but sexuality. And as we all know, these discussions have become some of the really most difficult to have in the ecumenical movement. So you might say it is odd then that the church towards a common vision is mainly silent even about women in the church, and the meaning of that silence demands interpretation. The opening paragraph, and then on the next slide, we can see this. According to the Bible, man and woman were created in God's image, so bearing an inherent capacity for communion, in Greek koinonia, with God and with one another. And in a moving and significant passage in TCTCB, Mary is described as symbol of and model for both the church and the individual Christian. But the only explicit reference in the text to the dividing issues is in the section about ordained ministry, where the text says, Christians disagree as well over the traditional restriction of ordination to the ministry of word and sacrament to men only. So the responses to the text, well, many of them make no comment on these issues because there weren't many in the text. A few said it was regrettable that the document is silent and that this is a serious omission. One response said, the ordination of women results from the nature and mission of the gospel and is not up for negotiation. And one urged that defending human life and dignity must include defending the dignity of women, and thus we must talk about questions of gender. One church noted that the text traces ordained ministry to the Lord's choice of the 12 and argues that this promotes the view that some aspects of the church's order were willed by Christ himself. One council of churches responded by saying that the text seems to avoid the very matters that are now dividing the church and are threats to Christian unity, and that they found this frustrating and inexplicable. And another council said that the Faith and Order Commission ought to raise up more powerfully the general issue of women's full participation. A number of churches asked us for a more confident theology of the whole people of God, the laos, to shape our understanding of the church. So this is one subject where visible unity seems in some places further away and where more work is surely needed. The question of ordination in relation to women is one thing, but some responses also raise those questions about whether we should speak of the complementarity of male and female or the overcoming in Christ of gender division, and wanted the ecumenical movement to address this painful division over these issues. This is a lively and sometimes tense area of discussion, one that TCTCB did not acknowledge fully and which the responses do not entirely reflect either in consequence. So after this text, it seems imperative to address theological issues about what it means to be human beings together and about the role of women in the church, as well as in the whole community of humankind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan, for this very profound introduction, both into what TCTCV said about the role of women in the ministry of the church, but also about the responses to what TCTCV said, or actually not said, because obviously the biggest finding is actually that TCTCV did not really address the question of women's ministry and women's participation in the church, and the very few churches actually addressed the question of women's full participation in their responses. And among those who responded, it seems that there is no agreement on the issue, which actually shows us that there is quite a bit of work to be done in the future. And it's interesting to see that this theme has not been really on the table of the ecclesiological work of Faith and Order for very many years. Susan has also prepared a paper giving a very good overview, I think, on the work done within the Faith and Order context on the issue of women's ministry, which will be a part of a collection of papers from Faith and Order on the themes we found in the papers. We will come back to discussing what you raised, and I also already now want to tell all the participants of this webinar that they can post their questions in the chat. So we will come back to your questions later on when we have finished our presentations. But you can already now think about participating in the discussion by posting your questions in the chat, and you are very welcome to do so. Our next speaker is Paul Meindorf, Emeritus Professor of the Liturgical Theology at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in New York. Paul has been a member of Faith and Order since 2004, actively involved in the discussion on the reception of TCTCV during all these years. Paul is also a member of the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation and the St. Irenaeus Orthodox Catholic Working Group. So we are very happy, Paul, that you have been looking specifically into the understanding of ordained ministry, the threefold ministry in TCTCV and in the responses by the churches. So the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning to everybody from dark and rainy Seattle. It doesn't look like the picture behind me. Baptism Eucharist ministry affirms that the threefold ministry of bishop, presbyter, and deacon may serve today as an expression of the unity we seek and as a means for achieving it. Among the gifts of the Holy Spirit that constitute the Church, a ministry of oversight, episcope, is necessary to express and safeguard the unity of the body, chapter 23. BEM states that it is important to be aware of the changes of the threefold ministry has undergone in the history of the Church. In the earliest instances, the bishop was a leader of the local Eucharistic community and was surrounded by a college of presbyters and by deacons who assisted in his tasks. In this local context, the bishop's ministry was a focus of unity within the whole community. Soon, bishops began to exercise episcopae over several local communities at the same time in chapter 21. BEM states further that the traditional threefold pattern raises questions for all the churches. Churches maintaining the threefold pattern will need to ask how its potential can be fully developed for the most effective witness of the church in the world. Churches not having the threefold pattern should also participate in this task. They will further need to ask themselves whether the threefold pattern as developed does not have a powerful claim to be accepted by them. Paragraph 53. Now, the Church Towards a Common Vision states that almost all Christian communities today have a formal structure of ministry. Frequently, this structure is diversified and reflects the threefold pattern of episkopos, presbyteros, diakonos, more or less explicitly, paragraph 47. The challenge to unity that TCTV identifies is the question of the historic episcopate. That is the main focus in its discussion on this issue. Some churches believe that the threefold ministry is a sign of continuing faithfulness to the gospel. Others, however, do not view faithfulness to the gospel as closely bound to this concept, and some are wary of the historic episcopate because they see it as vulnerable to abuse and thus potentially harmful to the well-being of the community. Building on BEM, TCTCV asked the churches if they, given the signs of growing agreement about the place of ordained ministry in the church, can achieve a consensus as to whether the threefold ministry is part of God's will for the church in its realization of the unity which God wills. Now, looking at the responses, it's interesting that only about 20 of the responses to TCTV given to the Commission on Faith and Order discuss the question of the threefold ministry. None of them discusses the issue at considerable length. There's a wide spectrum of reactions. The response of the Roman Catholic Church affirms the essential aspect of the threefold ministry and stresses that TCTCV goes beyond BEM, whereas BEM only affirmed that the threefold ministry, quote, may serve as an expression of the unity we seek, unquote. TCTCV poses the challenge more directly in the italicized text following paragraph 47. Quote, given the signs of growing agreement about the place of ordained ministry in the church, we are led to ask if the churches can achieve a consensus as to whether or not the threefold ministry is part of God's will for the church in its realization of the unity which God wills, unquote. While the Roman Catholic Church's response stresses the essential role of the threefold ministry, it situates this ministry within a baptismal ecclesiology that recognizes the priestly, prophetic, and royal road of all the baptized, emphasizing the complementary dimension of lay and ordained. And with regard to the episcopate, the response stresses the conciliar nature of the episcopate at all levels in the life of the church. The Orthodox response similarly stresses the essential character of the threefold ministry and emphasize its personal character. There can be no episcope without the episkopos. While the responses do not develop this further, it is evident that they would also find themselves in agreement with the baptismal ecclesiology that recognizes the priesthood of the faithful, and that they would also stress the notion of conciliarity that has been at the heart of bilateral dialogues between Orthodox and Catholics. Among the churches issuing out of the Reformation, there is, as we would expect, considerable diversity, but importantly, not hostility, but rather openness to discussion of the issue. And I'll just cite a few examples. The Methodist Church in Britain would, quote, willingly receive the sign of episcopal succession on the understanding that ecumenical partners sharing this sign with the Methodist Church, one, acknowledge that the latter has been and is part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and B, accepts that different interpretations of the precise significance of the sign exist. The Church of Sweden has more clearly adopted the threefold order of ordained ministry with bishops, priests, and deacons through the Church Ordinance of 2000. The Evangelical Church of Finland writes in its response that it is appropriate to underline that all authority in the Church should serve the core function of the Church, the gospel and its expression, in accordance with a normative interpretation of the revelation and the doctrine of the church. On the question of ordained ministry, makes it possible to make progress in ecumenical dialogue. This question is also related to the manner in which we address a ministry of universal unity. The Scottish Episcopal Church has found it helpful to recognize that all ministry incorporates diaconal, presbyteral, and episcopal functions, and that all forms of ordained ministry, as stated, exercised in personal, communal, and collegial ways. I think I will skip to my conclusion just to open for discussions, but I think you get a sense of kind of the nuanced and diverse ways in which churches from the Reformation address this issue. The fact that only 25% of the responses even address the question of threefold ministry is itself significant. It is evident that largely as a consequence of BEM, the issue has become far less divisive and is no longer high on the ecumenical agenda. All churches agree on the necessity of ministry and forms of oversight, episcopae. Mutual recognition of ministries remains elusive, though it has come to pass in a number of bilateral and multilateral agreements in recent decades. Among the achievements of BEM and subsequent developments is an acknowledgement that ministry has historically taken multiple forms, and that oversight has and is being exercised in different ways in different churches, sometimes by ordained individuals, at other times by conciliar groups, variably consisting of both lay and ordained. It thus becomes possible to discern a principle of dynamic equivalence at work in the exercise of oversight. Even the churches that have no formal episcopate, in fact, have structures, whether individual or collegial, that exercise that ministry. Further reflection on the ways in which the churches actually exercise ministry and oversight may help to ease the path toward the mutual recognition of ministries. The responses also reflect developments that have occurred in recent years among the churches as they have reflected together on the implications of baptism. This was encouraged by the work of Faith in Order that resulted in the release of the Faith in Order Commission study document, One Baptism Toward Mutual Recognition. The work on baptismal theology leads the churches to consider the place of the baptized laity in all aspects of the life of the church, including in the sharing of ministry and in the exercise of authority. Common reflection on the role of the baptized, a baptismal ecclesiology, could, for example, help to ease tensions between clergy and laity in individual churches. And in the context of the ecumenical enterprise, focusing on baptismal identity could help to overcome what is sometimes perceived as an overly institutional and clerical approach to ecclesiology, the exercise of authority and ministry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul, for this introduction. I think it's very interesting to see how the BEM's emphasis on the threefold ministry and also how it is underlined in TCTCV that all churches agree on the necessity of ministry and forms of oversight, that there is both a real progress in the understanding at the same time, also still huge hindrances when it comes to the mutual recognition of ministry. Paul, you are in your paper and also based on the responses pointing to the possibility of a way forward, maybe not so much focusing on the threefold ministry and the structures of the ordained ministry, but taking a starting point in baptismal ecclesiology. And I think we need to come back to that in the discussion afterwards, because it's important for us as Faith and Order Commission also to look forward. How can we actually get further on our road towards Christian unity, learning from the processes that have been, and also finding new ways and approaches to come closer to each other. So thank you so much, Paul. And I now have the pleasure to give the word to our third speaker, Bishop Brian Farrell. Bishop Brian was born in Dublin, Ireland, and studied in Ireland, Spain, Rome, and the United States, and was ordained a priest in 1969. In 1981, he entered the Vatican Secretariat of State, and in the 1990s, he became department head in the first section. Bishop Brian obtained a doctorate from the Gregorian University in Rome in systematic theology. Since 2002, he has been the secretary of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, vice president of the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with Judaism. In these years, Bishop Brian has participated in numerous bilateral dialogues, multilateral dialogues, and has been a member of the joint working group between the WCC and the Roman Catholic Church for all that time. So you're a very experienced ecumenical theologian, taking part in ecumenical meetings, visits, and studies, and dialogues and conversations. And we are looking so much forward to listening to you and your reflections on what you have heard so far. The floor is yours, Bishop Brian.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Let me say, first of all, that in the Catholic approach to the ecumenical movement, faith and order has always been a cherished part of the search for Christian unity. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to be part of the discussion of the Church towards a common vision. It's clear that attention to ecclesiology is central to ecumenism. Without agreement on the vision of the Church, full communion will not happen. It took 3 decades to prepare the convergence text, which expresses how far Christian communities have come in their common understanding of the Church. The Catholic Church, the Catholic response was prepared over a number of years in consultation with bishops and bishops' conferences, experts, ecumenical groups, lay movements. This response sees the Church towards a common vision as a significant step on the way to a common vision of the Church, but not yet the agreement needed for full communion. Thanks to our presenters for their very well articulated presentation of the themes, the 2 themes, as they are presented in the Church and in the responses. Let me first address the concept of the role of women in the Church. Not simply the question of ordination, but the broader question, as Professor Durbin brought out, of our theological understanding of what it means to be human and how gender fits into that understanding. We have to be clear that the role of women in the Church as a point of discussion is a reflection of the fact that a seismic movement is taking place in society itself, in our human consciousness. As such, it demands a response from the churches. It is a transversal question that affects all aspects of church life, doctrinal and practical. Professor Durbin mentioned that BEM raised the question but received little follow-up. She adds that at Busan, the issue was considered but as unfinished business. I think we're still in the unfinished business part. In the Catholic Church, the question is placed at various levels. One is the more general question of the Church's understanding of the role of women in salvation history, and hence in the Church's mission and structures. The other is the sacramental question of women's ordination. In this brief presentation, I can't advocate for one side or another, but only try to lay out the component parts of the discussion from the Catholic perspective. Among Catholic commentators, there are different approaches. One is to give attention to specific questions inequality, discrimination, violence, social role, empowerment, and to urge the Church to respond in its teaching and pastoral activity and in its advocacy for change. Other commentators insist that there is no doctrinal or theological reason why women should not have every right and opportunity in the Church that men do. And I think it's safe to say that this awareness is growing and having visible results insofar as women are taking on a more public role in the Church, in theology, in church tribunals, in the general life of the Church. In a global church like ours, present in many different cultural contexts, the pace of this process is not uniform. While cultures change by evolution and not by revolution, there is still a prophetic role for the Church in healing and uplifting the way societies value their members, and therefore value also the role of women in their community. Another question which is hugely important in the discussions in the Catholic Church is the issue of ordination. Perhaps we can say that the ecumenical movement generally seems to have decided that the question of women's ordination has reached a kind of settlement. Certain churches do, and certain churches don't. And there is, in my opinion, there's little real discussion, either bilaterally or multilaterally, of the question. It needs to be said that in the Catholic perspective, the sacrament of orders, bishop, priest, and deacon, is not a human right. In the Catholic view, no one has a right to be ordained, but only those who are called by the authority of the Church. Like the other churches of the first millennium, the Catholic Church continues to hold that the biblical witness and tradition does not support women's ordination. Until recently, that exclusion was supported by the place afforded women by society and culture. Today, in a large part of the world, a different sensitivity and growth of consciousness lifts up a demand for a serious new reflection, even a demand for change. The Catholic Church so far has responded to calls for change by stating that it does not have the authority to change that long-standing tradition. This does not mean that the question is not being discussed, even at the level of the Church's magisterium or teaching office. Pope Francis has already appointed 2 commissions to study the issue of the ordination of women to the diaconate. From the Catholic point of view, a change of this importance, admitting women to ordination, calls for clarification in at least two areas. One, the historical experience of the Church diachronically. Did such a thing ever exist? Or at least is there nothing in the tradition that categorically excludes the possibility? Interpreting the tradition has not proven as simple as might be expected. Much is being written on the subject, but for something more official, we must, as Catholics, await the findings of the commission in question and the decisions that will follow. The second, more profound and difficult dimension of the question is the issue of the authority of the Church. Can the Church decide that the new role of women in society is a providential sign of the times? In other words, a context willed by God that carries in itself new demands and new possibilities for salvation history as it unfolds in the Church among the pilgrim people of God on its way through time. This might sound paradoxical, especially when said about the Catholic Church. But some theologians are proposing that the Church needs to recover a greater sense of its own authority. The earliest community of disciples had to decide on a matter of the greatest consequence, whether to admit the Gentiles into what was until then an exclusively Jewish community. They decided on the basis of their experience, in which they clearly saw the working of the Holy Spirit. Any change today would have to be the result not only of reflection, discussion, and decision, but above all, the result of the whole body of the church, hierarchically organized, being convinced that the change was agreeable to the Holy Spirit. Clearly, we are a long way from such a universal consciousness in our church. In the second presentation, Professor Meindorf traces the ecumenical treatment of the Threefold Ministry from Bem to the church. Bem fundamentally presents the development of the Threefold Ministry in the early church, affirms its value, and suggests that churches see the potential of this model for mission and unity. 30 years later, the Church Towards a Common Vision notes that the model of the Threefold Ministry is gaining acceptance in some churches. The question, though, is this: how necessary is the model of the Threefold Ministry for further convergence and for the ultimate goal of visible unity? Is the historical continuity of the model of the Threefold Ministry of the essence, in other words, God's will for the church, or only a factor of contingent historical evolution? The churches of the first millennium all see this Threefold Ministry as belonging to the very constitution of the church. What one church's response called the universal default standard. This, of course, is the Catholic and Orthodox position. In this view, ministry in all its forms and levels, in spite of personal and collective deficiencies in their historical realization, should not be seen as above the whole body of the church, but as a service of teaching, sanctifying, and shepherding in the framework of the baptismal ecclesiology. The fact that too often this service has been turned into dominion and even privilege is not an argument against a specific idea of ministry, but a demand for conversion and purification. The churches of the second millennium offer a variety of approaches, different understandings of the sacramentality of the church, and therefore of ordained ministry. In the Catholic Church, there is no real critical discussion of the tradition of the Threefold Ministry. That structure of ministry, you might say, is co-natural with the church. Catholic ecumenists often underline that the way forward in ecumenical discussion of ministry involves a wide continuing reflection on the notion of church itself, of the kind that the Church Towards a Common Vision has begun. Without a precise notion of church, we will not have the principles that govern ministry. They see the discussion on ministry as being at the heart of the ecumenical challenge. By this, they mean that if we cannot agree on what is church, we will not agree on what is unity, and therefore we will not agree on what is legitimate diversity, since unity is communion in faith and life, and not external uniformity. To what extent can we have a plural concept of church and therefore a differentiated concept of ministry? Allow me to say that this seems to me to be the great challenge facing the ecumenical movement. We need what some people are calling a new hermeneutic of difference that neither neglects the demands of unity nor underestimates legitimate diversity. More than 60 years of bilateral and multilateral dialogues have shown that some differences regarding faith and order are not entirely reconcilable. Aware of these conflicting views, we need a new approach to how the churches deal with theological, liturgical, canonical, and moral diversity. Thankfully, Faith and Order is giving attention to this demand. Professor Meindorf mentions that the question of which differences are legitimate and which need to be overcome remains ambiguous in the church towards a common vision. So we need a way forward. Is it possible to open a new phase of bilateral and multilateral dialogue regarding which differences, doctrinal, ethical, practical, the churches are able and willing to recognize in each other? I'm afraid, however, that given the enormous challenges facing faith and religion today, the churches will find it hard to have the energy and the courage to open this path. Convinced ecumenists will need to convince their parent bodies that progress in the ecumenical task is the solution, not the problem. Let me conclude. As you know, the Catholic Church is now fully engaged in a search for a more synodal way of being and of understanding itself as church. Can I say that Pope Francis leading the Catholic Church towards a more synodical self-awareness and practice implies, among other issues, a search for a more correct balance in the interaction between the baptismal character of all the church's members and the ordained ministry. The process, entitled For a Synodal Church, Communion, Participation, and Mission, is conceived as a multi-year process that will take place on the local, regional, and universal levels, and will be followed by the implementation phase that will again involve the particular churches. The synodal process begins with consultation and is meant to end with discernment of what the Holy Spirit is saying to the church today. At every stage of the synodal process, it is expected that Christians from other churches will be invited to participate. For the Catholic Church, the Synod offers a great opportunity to include the questions of ministry and the role of women in the church in the process of reform and aggiornamento begun by the Second Vatican Council, but still far from complete. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop Sproul, for this very interesting analysis and discussion of Susan and Paul's inputs from a Roman Catholic side. There's many aspects which we could discuss now in the remaining 12 minutes, but I would like to give the possibility to both Paul and Susan to respond to what you have been saying. You have been, in a way, confirming both what Paul said on the need for broader consultation and move towards an inclusion of conciliar structures and also in the understanding of ministry and ministries in the church. And in a way, you have been confirming what Paul has said on the need for a baptismal ecclesiology. When it comes to Susan's paper, you also clearly see the challenges which are still there. And personally, I get challenged by your emphasis also on, and your discussion on the relation between changes in society and changes in churches, and the legitimacy of changes in churches in relation to ongoing changes in society. And you also referred to the first major change when the Apostles' Council decided that the gospel should be for all people, not only the Jews. So this is also a very interesting theme, among other relating to other themes we have discussing on unity and legitimate diversity in the church. But I now would like to give Susan or Paul the possibility to comment on what they have heard. And maybe Susan first.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Bishop Farrell, for your very profound and gentle remarks. I was really struck by what you said about the need for a new hermeneutic of difference. And I think I recognize that we've come to a place where, because some issues are so difficult, we say, well, some churches do this and some churches do that. Some churches believe this and something else. And there are some issues where it's almost feels too dangerous to open up the difference. So we've become reconciled to our diversity rather than seeing it as disunity. And I would hope that we could get to a place, find a place where we could safely begin to open up and discuss in the way that you so beautifully did about why we believe certain things and what spaces there are for movement and learning from each other. So I was encouraged by so much of what you said. Thank you.
Paul,
Yeah,
would you like to respond as well?
sure. In response to Bishop Farrell, I mean, I find it striking how the extent to which ecumenical discussions that began well before BEM have been influencing the internal life of the churches. I mean, you know, since the Roman Catholic Church issued the Ut Unum Sint document, I mean, there has been a huge amount of reaction and discussion about primacy, synodality, and so on, which has, you know, become a major topic of discussion in both bilateral and multilateral discussions, and has had large impact on the internal life of all of our churches. In other words, we can no longer live in isolation. I welcome the fact that, you know, in the conciliar process now beginning in the Catholic Church, other outsiders, I mean, people from other churches will be invited to, as guests, to participate in different ways. And I know that underneath the surface, actually, that discussion is already ongoing and much deeper than many people realize. So, you know, I think frameworks such as the Church Towards a Common Vision, I think are very helpful to guide, kind of, not to guide, but to inform the discussion in our respective churches and the amount and the resulting amount of convergence. The very fact that the threefold ministry is really no longer the divisive issue that it was before BEM. So I'm very grateful for the process and happy to be able to participate in it.
The threefold ministry is no longer a divisive issue, but still many churches wouldn't agree on the understanding of the threefold ministry and on the way the ministry is enacted and lived out in the churches. And not at least when we read the responses, we could also see that many churches are not so interested in discussing ministerial structures anymore. They say there are other issues which are more pressing. Susan, you pointed to some of these issues when it comes to for instance, the role of women and the whole understanding of humankind. Where is the way forward, do you think, for faith and order? Should we continue to elaborate on the threefold ministry and the understanding of the historical episcopate and so on, the way we have done, and try to find new ways, or is there a way forward in a different way, which could help us to come closer to each other? You have so many years of faith and order experience. So,
well, I think there have been major steps forward. For example, when we saw that it made a difference to certain, you know, Christians of the Reformation, if instead of talking about episcopacy, you talk about episcopae, and seeing how many of our ministries in all sorts of churches are about episcopae, are about oversight and about presbyteral ministry and diaconal ministry, that though they might not necessarily be expressed in three different orders. So I think there has been some huge steps forward there. I think it may well be, Bishop Farrell certainly made a good point when he said that churches now in many places are under so much stress because of all sorts of pressing things, poverty and inequality and COVID, that debating questions about what orders of ministry you have seems to be a rather second order discussion. But of course, in order for the church to be the church, it needs to have those who will celebrate the sacraments, those who will serve the community, and those who will give oversight and leadership. So in actual fact, in order to meet the profound needs of the world, we need those three things, however we embody them.
There's a couple of questions now. Firstly, there's a question from Andrea Saria, in a way asking for a move when it comes to the understanding of female priesthood, and saying if the gospel has nothing to do with, then things should stop us, asking for now it's on time actually to make a change. Then there's a question from Eleanor Jackson asking what happened between the 1960s work and BEM, which you can read the question in the chat. And I wonder whether maybe Odair is the one who knows exactly what happened between the 1960s work and BEM when it comes to this question. So if you could jump into the discussion, Odair, that would be nice. Then we have a comment from Winnie from Kenya. Do we have women in the conversation? Do we have a movement within the Roman Catholic Church advocating for this right for women? Is the discussion in Rome also in the grassroots? So that's a direct question to you, Bishop Brian. But maybe first Odair, and then I give the word to Bishop Brian.
Well, I mean, what I could do at this point in relation to this historical question is simply to say that following the New Delhi WCC Assembly, whose vision of unity, by the way, is largely shaped by Leslie Newbigin, who used to belong to the same church as Susan, the Faith and Order Commission held a world conference during Vatican II in Montreal in '63, and the interpretation of that conference in light of the developments in the Catholic Church will lead in '64 in Aarhus and in '67 in Bristol to the definitions of the following steps, and they took the shape primarily of collecting achievements of faith and order from past studies and meetings in relation to the three topics. And so BEM will be the expression of that harvesting the fruits of the work that had been done before the 60s, but primarily during the period of Vatican II, Montreal, and so forth. That's what comes to expression in 1982. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very thorough description and answer to the question here in the chat. Bishop Brian, would you like to respond to Winnie Meadows' question from Kenya?
Yes, I think we would need to have a good discussion over a long period, but let me say two things that come to my mind. There are two ways of discussing something. One is to have an objective approach in which you listen to all sides and you try to find the rationale behind the decisions that need to be made, and therefore the decisions are not the result of a pressure or a lobby. And the other way is, of course, to kind of lobby, to push, to make demands that are not fully thought out, perhaps. So both are happening, I think, in our church. There are people who see certain a certain discrimination against women, and they fight that. There are those who see that not ordaining women is a discrimination in the same way that poverty or unjust laws or whatever is a discrimination against human beings. I think that if we see the church as God's way of offering transcendent salvation, therefore every question has to be put in relation to what we believe to be what he wants of the church. And I think that's the context that ultimately has to determine any response that we give to the demands for there's no problem with a greater role for women in the church. The only question we have is the question of ordination. And that is a question that will need time and effort, but also the patience to come all together, the whole body of the church, to understand what it is that God wants. I don't think we can go to bed at night and wake up in the morning and know exactly how that works. It takes the whole body to move together, and that's a huge effort.
This seems to me like a very good conclusion of this webinar today. We are at the end of the time which is available. Thank you so much to all the speakers and everyone who has involved into the conversation. I think today's webinar shows that there is still a lot of work to be done, but also that there is a way forward. There's a hope and there is a need, not because the questions are important in themselves, but because we need to stand together as Christians, as churches, as the Christian church, for the sake of the credibility of the Christian gospel. And that's why we still have to continue to work on all the differences, but that's also why we hope that there is a way forward. And I would thank all of you to involve in this journey, and also thanks to all of all of you who have attended the webinar here and there all around the world. Thanks to everyone for joining into the webinar, and we will continue the conversation in the future.